Think about the most advanced city you know. Imagine it tomorrow, not destroyed by war, not decaying from neglect, but simply gone. The streets empty, the homes silent, every tool, every pot, every possession left exactly where it was used. Now imagine this happened not in some remote village, but in a civilization that controlled trade routes across an entire sea. This is not a story from science fiction. This is the mystery that has haunted archaeologists for nearly 200 years. In the mid-19th century, British surveyors mapped a thriving city on the coast of the Persian Gulf. Decades later, when explorers returned to study it, the city had vanished, not a ruin, not a trace, as if it had been erased from the face of the earth overnight. And the most unsettling part? The local Bedouin tribes had no memory of it ever existing. So what happened to a city that was clearly marked on official maps, documented in military logs, and then disappeared without a single witness? What you are about to hear challenges everything we assume about how civilizations end. This is a story about a city that should not have vanished, and about the unsettling possibility that our own history is filled with holes we have not yet learned to see. Over the next few minutes, you will discover a map that led explorers to nothing but sand. You will hear about a civilization that built massive stone cities in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. You will learn about a catastrophe so sudden that an entire culture left behind no survivors, no refugees, and no explanation. And you will be left with a question that archaeologists still cannot answer. How does a city simply disappear? The story begins in 1850 with a British naval survey of the Persian Gulf. The British Empire was methodically mapping every coastline, every port, and every settlement in the region. Leading this survey was Lieutenant J.R. Wellstead of the Indian Navy, a meticulous cartographer whose maps would become the standard for decades. As his ship moved along the coast of what is now Saudi Arabia, Wellstead documented a settlement called Hidan. His notes describe a substantial town with stone buildings, a protected harbor, and a population engaged in pearl diving and trade. He placed it on the official British Admiralty charts. But here's where the story takes its first strange turn. 40 years later, in 1890, a British political agent named J.G. Lorimer was compiling a comprehensive gazetteer of the Gulf. When he sent surveyors to locate Hidan, they found nothing. No ruins, no scattered stones, no local knowledge of any settlement ever existing at that location. The Bedouin tribes who lived in the area had no name for it, no stories about it, and no tradition of a city ever being there. Lorimer was forced to mark it as a mystery in his records, a city that appeared on official maps, documented by a trained naval officer, had simply ceased to exist. How is this possible? Think about what this means. We are not talking about a mythical city from ancient texts. We are talking about a place that a British naval officer stood in, walked through, and recorded in the 19th century. And yet, within a single generation, it was as if it had never been. The initial explanation was simple. The shifting sands of the Arabian Peninsula had buried it. But when archaeologists finally returned in the 1950s, they discovered something far more disturbing. The city had not been buried, it had been abandoned, and the abandonment did not follow any known pattern. Now imagine this. In 1953, a Danish archaeological expedition led by Geoffrey Bibby arrived in the region to investigate the ancient Dilmun civilization, a Bronze Age culture mentioned in Mesopotamian texts as a land of paradise and trade. Bibby was following the same maps that had guided British surveyors a century earlier, but instead of finding the remains of a 19th century town, his team uncovered something much older. At a site called Khor al-Maharak, they found the foundations of a massive city dating back to 2100 BCE. The walls were made of finely cut stone, the streets were laid out in a deliberate grid pattern, and the water systems were sophisticated enough to support a population of thousands. But here is the impossibility factor. This city was located in a region with no fresh water source. The The nearest oasis was over 50 miles away. The only explanation was that the inhabitants had engineered an elaborate system of wells and cisterns, collecting seasonal rainfall and storing it in quantities large enough to sustain a major urban center. Even today, modern engineers struggle to maintain water security in this part of the Arabian Peninsula. So how did a Bronze Age civilization achieve what Bedouin tribes could not? And why did they choose to build a city in a place that offered no obvious advantage for survival? But this is where it gets strange. The city at Khor al-Maharak was not isolated. As Bibi continued his survey, he discovered a network of settlements stretching over 100 miles along the coast. Each settlement was connected by carefully maintained roads. Each had the same distinctive architecture, the same water systems, and the same layout. This was not a collection of villages. This was a planned, organized civilization that controlled the entire eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. At its center was a city called Dilmun, located on the island of Bahrain, which ancient texts described as a trading hub connecting Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Arabian interior. The scale of this civilization was staggering. Archaeologists have since uncovered over 50,000 burial mounds in the region, each one carefully constructed and oriented to the stars. That's larger than the cemetery complex at Giza. And yet, this entire civilization vanished without a trace. No invasion was recorded, no famine is mentioned in any text. The Mesopotamians, who traded extensively with Dilmun, simply stopped mentioning them around 1800 BCE, as if their trading partner had been erased from existence. So what happened? For decades, archaeologists believed that climate change was the answer. The region experienced a gradual drying trend around 2000 BCE, making agriculture increasingly difficult. But here's the problem with that theory. Gradual climate change does not cause an entire civilization to abandon its cities overnight. People adapt, they migrate, they leave behind evidence of their departure. But at sites like Khor al-Maharak, there is no evidence of a slow decline. The pottery stops in a single layer. The tools are left in place. The water systems show no signs of being maintained after a specific date. It's as if the entire population simply walked away from their homes and never returned. And this is where the 19th century disappearance of Hidan takes on a new and unsettling significance. Because when archaeologists examined the British records more closely, they found something extraordinary. The city of Hidan was built directly on top of the Bronze Age ruins. The 19th century inhabitants had been living among ancient stones, using the same wells and walking the same streets as a civilization that had vanished 4,000 years earlier. And then they vanished too. Two civilizations separated by millennia, occupying the same location, both disappearing without explanation. Now consider the evidence that has emerged in the last 15 years. In 2008, a team of geologists led by Dr. Richard Hodges from the University of Southampton began analyzing sediment cores from the Persian Gulf. Their goal was to understand the environmental history of the region. What they found was a layer of fine-grained marine sediment dating to precisely 2100 DCE, the period when the Dilmun civilization was at its peak. This sediment could only have been deposited by a massive tsunami. But here is the impossibility factor. The Persian Gulf is a shallow basin with an average depth of only 50 meters. Tsunamis in such shallow water are extremely rare because the energy dissipates quickly. For a tsunami to deposit sediment across 100 miles of coastline, the initial wave would have had to be generated by an event of unimaginable power, an earthquake, a volcanic collapse, or something else entirely. The geological evidence points to a single catastrophic event that struck the entire Gulf Coast simultaneously. The wave would have traveled at over 500 miles per hour, giving the inhabitants no warning. Entire coastal cities would have been scoured clean, their populations swept into the sea, their stone walls reduced to rubble. But here is the question that still haunts archaeologists. If a tsunami destroyed these cities, why is there no evidence of rebuilding? Why did the survivors not return? And why did the Mesopotamians, who recorded everything from eclipses to epidemics, simply never mention a wave that would have devastated their own coastline? This brings us to the most unsettling discovery of all. In 1954, the Danish expedition uncovered a massive fortification wall at the site of Qalat al-Bahrain, the capital of the Dilmun civilization. The wall was over 15 feet thick and showed clear signs of having been destroyed by war. But when they excavated the interior of the city, they found something that defied explanation. The buildings had been systematically dismantled, not collapsed by an earthquake, not washed away by a wave, dismantled, stone by stone, as if the inhabitants had taken their city apart before leaving. Archaeologists have since discovered that this pattern repeats across every major Dilmun site. The cities were not destroyed by a tsunami. They were abandoned in an organized manner, with valuable materials removed but everyday objects left behind. This is not how a civilization responds to a natural disaster. This is how a civilization responds to something they could not understand, something that convinced them to leave their homes and never look back. So what did they see? What did the survivors of that night witness that made them dismantle their cities, abandon their ancestors' tombs, and disappear from history? The only clue comes from a single Mesopotamian text, the Lament for Ur, which describes a catastrophe that struck the Gulf region around the same time. The text speaks of a storm that swept the land, of ships thrown onto the mountains, and of cities turned to ruins in a single day. But it also describes something strange. It says that the gods turned their faces away from the land and that the people forgot the names of their cities. Perhaps this is the most haunting part of the mystery. The people of Hidden, the 19th century settlement that vanished from British maps, also forgot the name of their city. When Lorimer asked the Bedouin about it, they had no memory, no stories, no traditions. Two civilizations separated by 4,000 years, both disappearing so completely that even the memory of their existence was erased, and both leaving behind the same physical evidence: cities dismantled, objects abandoned, and a coastline that bears the scars of a catastrophe we still cannot fully explain. So how do we make sense of this? The evidence points to a single event, perhaps a tsunami or a series of tsunamis that struck the Gulf Coast around 2100 BCE. The wave was so powerful that it destroyed the maritime infrastructure that the Dilmun civilization depended on. Without their harbors, without their ships, and without their trading partners, the survivors faced a choice. They could rebuild in a land that was now barren and isolated, or they could leave. They chose to leave. And over the following generations, the memory of their cities faded. The names of their kings were forgotten. Their language disappeared. And when the Bedouin tribes later moved into the region, they found only strange stones in the sand, with no stories to explain them. But here is the deeper question that this mystery forces us to confront. How many other civilizations have vanished in this way? How many cities have been erased so completely that we do not even know to look for them? We assume that history is a continuous line, that each civilization leaves traces for the next. But what if history is more like a palimpsest, a text that has been written over so many times that the original words are no longer visible? And this is where I want to ask you, where are you watching from? And what do you think happened to a city that was mapped, documented, and then vanished without a trace? Because the mystery of Hidden is not just about one lost city. It is about the fragility of everything we build, the maps we make, the records we keep, the cities we inhabit. They are all just one event away from becoming mysteries for future archaeologists to puzzle over. So the next time you walk through your own city, look at the stone walls, the water systems, the carefully laid out streets, and ask yourself, if you had to leave tonight, what would remain, and how long would it take for the memory to disappear? The lost city that disappeared overnight is not a legend, it is a warning. A reminder that civilizations are not permanent, they are moments. And sometimes, Those moments end not with a slow decline, but with a single night that no one survives to explain. The archaeologists will continue their work. The geologists will continue to search for evidence. But the truth about what happened on that coastline, on that night, may be lost forever, buried beneath the sand, erased from memory, waiting for the next generation to discover it and to ask the same question that we are asking now. How does a city simply disappear?